The wrench connected with the concrete floor with a deafening clang, missing her boot by inches. "Get out of here, you grease monkey dyke," the biker sneered, his leather jacket creaking as he leaned against her workbench. "Nobody wants a woman touching their machine anyway." Behind him, his 4 club brothers laughed, the sound echoing through the cavernous garage like hyenas circling wounded prey. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look up from the engine block before her. But in that moment, the warehouse fell deathly silent, as if the very air was holding its breath, because none of them knew they were standing in the presence of Ghost Angel, the most decorated female Delta Force commander in American military history. The morning sun filtered through the grimy skylights of Maverick's Edge Automotive, casting long shadows across the concrete floor of the sprawling warehouse-turned-mechanic shop. The facility occupied what used to be an industrial manufacturing plant on the outskirts of Northridge, Colorado, a town that had seen better days, nestled between the Rocky Mountains and the endless plains, where Interstate 70 cut through like a scar. The shop had been here for 3 years, but it still felt new, still felt out of place in a community that didn't quite know what to make of it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The walls were bare concrete, studded with oil stains that no amount of cleaning could erase. Workbenches lined the perimeter, each one organized with meticulous precision. Tools arranged by size, fluids sorted by type, replacement parts cataloged in a system that seemed almost military in its exactness. The smell of synthetic oil, metal, and diesel fuel hung permanently in the air, mingling with something else, the faint ghost of welding torch and brake dust. A dozen vehicle lifts were scattered throughout the space, some occupied by motorcycles in various states of repair, others empty and waiting. The owner of Maverick's Edge was a woman named Riley Vasquez. At 42 years old, she possessed a kind of quiet authority that had nothing to do with her physical presence, though that was striking enough. She was lean and muscular without appearing bulky, her frame marked by years of physical discipline. Her hands told a story: calloused palms, nicks and scars across her knuckles, short, functional fingernails perpetually stained with grease and motor oil. She wore simple work clothes: faded blue Dickies coveralls, a gray t-shirt underneath, steel-toed boots that had been through decades of shops and facilities. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and a thin, pale scar curved along the left side of her neck, disappearing beneath her collar, the kind of scar that came from something sudden and violent, not from any accident in a garage. Her face was weathered in a way that suggested she'd spent significant time under harsh sun and harder circumstances. Her eyes were perhaps her most striking feature, a pale gray blue that seemed to catalog everything they fell upon, constantly assessing, constantly aware. There was intelligence there, and something else too. The kind of presence that came from making life-and-death decisions, from leading people through impossible situations, from carrying the weight of decisions where mistakes meant funerals. Riley had opened Maverick's Edge 3 years ago, after circumstances had made traditional employment difficult. She'd poured most of her savings into the venture, rehabilitating the old warehouse, installing the lifts, setting up the diagnostic equipment. The shop specialized in high-performance motorcycles and vintage bike restorations, a niche market that attracted a particular clientele. Some customers were enthusiasts who treated their bikes like art projects. Others were serious riders who understood that a well-maintained machine was the difference between a smooth ride and a trip to the hospital. The shop wasn't wealthy, but it was stable. Riley kept overhead low, worked primarily alone, and hired occasional contract help when larger jobs required additional hands. She'd built a reputation for meticulous work, fair pricing, and remarkable discretion. Customers learned quickly not to ask questions about Riley's background. They could tell she had one: the way she moved, the way she assessed people, the way she never seemed surprised or frightened by anything, but she clearly had no interest in discussing it. Most of the townspeople in Northridge had accepted her presence with the casual indifference that small towns reserve for people who keep to themselves and don't cause trouble. She was the woman who runs the motorcycle shop, nothing more. She lived alone in a modest apartment above a defunct insurance office, shopped at the local grocery store, occasionally grabbed coffee at Brennan's Diner on Main Street, and otherwise maintained an existence of deliberate invisibility. That invisibility was about to be tested. The trouble had started about 2 months ago, when a motorcycle club called the Blackjacks began frequenting the shop. 12 strong initially, they'd grown to 20 by late summer. They were the kind of club that gave the motorcycle community a bad reputation, less interested in the machines themselves and more interested in using them as props for a lifestyle built on intimidation, drugs, and a specific brand of brutish masculinity. Their president, a man named Carson Devin, was a hulking specimen of 6'3" with a neck wider than most people's thighs and a collection of prison tattoos that covered every visible inch of his body. Devin had come into the shop one afternoon in early July with a 1987 Harley that needed comprehensive restoration. Riley had quoted him a price. He'd agreed to it. What should have been a straightforward transaction had become something far more complicated. The Blackjacks treated the shop like their personal headquarters. They'd linger for hours, parking their massive bikes around the facility, drinking beer from coolers they brought in defiance of the no alcohol sign Riley had posted prominently by the entrance. They'd make comments about her appearance, her capability, her right to be running a business. They'd move her tools without asking. They'd stand too close when she was working, invading her space in the way predators do when testing whether prey will fight back. Riley never escalated. She never raised her voice. She never complained or threatened to call the police. She simply worked around them, with them, through them, her focus remaining entirely on the machines, as if the bikers were merely obstacles in the shop, like equipment or architectural features that had to be navigated but ultimately ignored. This infuriated Carson Devin. Men like Devin were accustomed to a specific response to intimidation: fear, deference, or fighting back. Riley provided none of these. She was polite without being friendly, professional without being warm, utterly impervious to his attempts at domination. It was a response that suggested she'd encountered far worse than a motorcycle club president and his crew, and the suggestion itself was an insult. By late August, the dynamic had shifted from uncomfortable to hostile. Comments had become threats. Presence had become harassment. The Blackjacks had started showing up in larger numbers, staying longer, pushing boundaries with increasing aggression. Riley documented everything in a leather journal she kept locked in a desk in her small office. Dates, times, names, specific incidents. The journal was written in a spare, efficient style that suggested she was accustomed to official reports and formal documentation. She noted the incidents not with emotion or complaint, but as if logging a mission debrief. What she didn't do was call for help. What she didn't do was ask for protection. What she didn't do was betray even the slightest hint of concern. She simply waited, continued her work, and studied the men who came to her shop with the same careful attention she once devoted to far more dangerous adversaries. The real confrontation was coming. Everyone could feel it. The morning Riley met Marcus Holloway started like any other Tuesday in September. She'd arrived at Maverick's Edge at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before sunrise, which had become her routine. The shop was silent, untouched by the chaos that had begun to define her daylight hours. She made coffee in the small break room at the back, the same weak brew she made every morning, and settled into her routine, checking the overnight messages on her answering machine, reviewing the day's scheduled jobs, inventorying the parts she'd need. The first sign that this day would be different came at 6:32 a.m. A truck pulled up outside, a newer Ford F-250, pristine despite the early hour, with a custom trailer hitched to the back. The trailer carried a motorcycle that made Riley pause mid-inventory. It was a 1965 Triumph Bonneville, the kind of bike that existed more in legend than in reality. The original design was iconic, but finding one in this condition, and finding someone willing to bring it to a shop like hers, was unusual enough to command attention. The man who climbed out of the truck was even more unusual. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the kind of posture that came from decades of deliberate physical discipline. His age was difficult to determine, somewhere between 55 and 65, but with a quality of vitality that suggested rigorous maintenance. His face was weathered but sharp, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalog the shop and its contents in a single sweeping glance. He wore simple clothes, jeans, a navy polo shirt, a light jacket, but they were tailored, expensive, worn by someone accustomed to both formality and physical activity. What caught Riley's attention most was his hands. They bore the same marks as hers, small scars, the particular calluses that came from specific types of work, the faint discoloration on the knuckles from years of impact. And his eyes. Those eyes held the same quality of assessment, the same constant awareness, the same subtle indication that he'd spent significant portions of his life in situations where missing details got people killed. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that didn't require volume. "I'm looking for the owner. I was told this is the best restoration shop in 3 states. Riley set down her clipboard. "That would be me. Riley Vasquez. Marcus Holloway." He didn't offer a handshake, which Riley appreciated. "That's a 1965 Bonneville on my trailer. I've been looking for the right person to restore it for 8 years. Someone finally mentioned your shop." "It's a beautiful bike," Riley said, moving toward the window to get a better look at the trailer. "You've kept it well maintained." "I have, but it needs more than maintenance. It needs resurrection." He paused, turning to look at her directly. "I need someone who understands that machines aren't just machines. Their history, their stories. They're the embodiment of someone's vision made metal and fuel." Something in his tone suggested he wasn't really talking about the motorcycle. "That's going to be expensive," Riley said, returning her attention to him. "Full restoration of a bike like that could run $50,000–$60,000. Maybe more if we encounter issues once we start disassembly." "Cost isn't the primary concern," Marcus replied. "Competence is. I need someone who can handle the technical aspects, obviously. But I also need someone who understands that some projects are about more than the final product." Riley studied him. "Why this shop? You could take that bike to any number of prestigious restoration facilities. Why come to Northridge, Colorado, to an independent operator working out of a repurposed warehouse?" For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Because I do my research. I heard about the woman running Maverick's Edge who works alone, who doesn't ask questions, who produces work that's nothing short of meticulous, and who has an unusual capacity for handling difficult situations without losing her composure." A chill ran down Riley's spine. She didn't show it. "The last part seems like an odd specification for a motorcycle restoration shop," she said carefully. "It is, isn't it?" Marcus moved toward the workbench, running his fingers along the edge without actually touching anything. "I was involved in military contracting for many years. Still am in advisory capacities. I've learned to recognize certain qualities in people. You have them. What qualities would those be?" "The ones that come from making decisions in high-stakes environments. The ones that come from responsibility for other people's lives. The ones that come from carrying secrets." He turned back to face her. "I'm not asking you to share those secrets. I'm simply acknowledging that I recognize their presence." The shop suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed to contract, the air to thicken. Riley had spent 3 years constructing a life of deliberate obscurity, and in the span of 6 minutes, this stranger had identified exactly what she'd been hiding. "If you're looking for someone to do restoration work," Riley said slowly, "I can do that. If you're looking for something else, I'm not interested." "I'm looking for restoration work," Marcus said. "That's all. But I should probably tell you that I'm aware of the situation you're experiencing with the Blackjacks Motorcycle Club, and I'm aware that you're handling it alone, which is both admirable and dangerous." Riley's jaw tightened. "How do you know about that?" "Small town. People talk. More importantly, I know Carson Devon. We've crossed paths professionally. He's not a sophisticated operator, but he's not entirely stupid either. He's testing boundaries because he senses something unusual about you, and men like Devon can't tolerate ambiguity. They need to establish dominance or find a reason to back away. Right now, he's in the testing phase." "And what makes you think I need assistance with Carson Devon?" "I don't think you do, actually," Marcus said. "I think you're more than capable of handling him and his crew. What I think is that you shouldn't have to handle it alone. And I think the moment of conflict is approaching." "Why would you care?" Riley asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He moved to the window, looking out at the Triumph Bonneville on the trailer, his expression thoughtful. Because, he finally said, I've spent a long time working with exceptional people in impossible situations, and I've learned that those people often carry their burden alone when they don't have to. It's a pattern I recognize. It's also a pattern that tends to end badly. He turned back to face her. I'd like to restore the Bonneville. And while that's happening, I'd like to understand more about what's really going on in this shop. I think you might be surprised by what I could offer, if you're willing to accept it. For the first time in 3 years, Riley's carefully constructed isolation was being directly challenged by someone who seemed to understand exactly what she was hiding. And she had no idea how to respond. The coffee had gone cold in Riley's mug by the time Marcus left the shop that morning. She'd given him a timeline for the restoration work, 6 months minimum, possibly longer depending on what they found once they started disassembly. She'd provided him with a contract, quoted him a price, and arranged for him to return the following week with the motorcycle on a proper flatbed so they could begin the initial assessment. What she hadn't done was acknowledge his comments about the blackjacks. What she hadn't done was express gratitude for his apparent knowledge of her situation. What she hadn't done was give him any indication that his offer of assistance was welcome or needed. Now, sitting alone in her office with the door closed and the shop quiet around her, Riley allowed herself to think about the implications of his arrival. Marcus Holloway had walked into her life like a door opening onto a room she'd spent 3 years trying to seal shut. His comment about military contracting and his recognition of qualities that came from making decisions in high-stakes environments weren't subtle. He knew something, maybe not everything, but enough to make her uncomfortable in ways she hadn't been uncomfortable in years. The question was whether his knowledge was a threat or simply observation. Riley had learned long ago that coincidence was often just the universe's way of saying you hadn't been careful enough. And coincidence didn't bring a man with that particular bearing to a motorcycle shop in a town of 8,000 people unless there was a reason for it. The Bonneville restoration could be legitimate. Could also be cover for something else entirely. She pulled out the leather journal where she documented the blackjack's behavior and flipped through the pages. 32 documented incidents over 2 months. Escalating aggression. No physical violence yet, but the trajectory was clear. Carson Devon was working toward something. A moment where he could push her hard enough to provoke a reaction, or at least hard enough to establish dominance and send her running. The journal had always been her way of maintaining control. Document everything. Create a record. Never let anything become emotional or personal. Keep it factual, clinical, precise. That was how she'd operated for 20 years. That was the discipline that had kept her alive through multiple deployments, through situations where panic would have killed her faster than any enemy combatant. But discipline couldn't stop Marcus Holloway from walking through her door. Around 10 a.m., the first of the day's legitimate customers arrived. A woman named Patricia Chun with a restored Indian Scout that needed minor brake work. Patricia was one of Riley's regulars. A pleasant woman in her 60s who treated her motorcycle like a family member and never lingered longer than necessary to discuss the work. She paid on time, tipped generously, and asked no personal questions. In Riley's world, Patricia was an ideal customer. The real trouble started around noon. The blackjacks arrived in force. 10 of them, which was larger than their typical afternoon contingent. They parked their bikes in a deliberate pattern that blocked 2 of Riley's main workspaces, climbed off their machines with a casual arrogance that had become their trademark, and settled into the shop like they owned it. Carson Devon was among them, along with 3 newer members Riley hadn't seen before. These 3 had the particular quality of men who were trying to prove something, which meant they were likely to be more aggressive, less predictable, and more dangerous than the established crew members. "Hey, Riley," Carson called out, his voice carrying across the warehouse. "Got something we need you to look at." Riley didn't look up from the Indian Scouts brake assembly. "I'm currently working on a paying job. I can schedule you for tomorrow afternoon." "Not really a request," one of the new guys said. A stocky man with a shaved head and a neck tattoo that crawled up toward his jaw. "We need it done now." This was the escalation Riley had been expecting. Not yet the breaking point, but the moment where the testing crossed into something more serious. The dynamic was shifting from harassment to attempted domination. She set down her tools slowly, deliberately, and turned to face them. When she did, her expression was neutral, not angry, not frightened, simply observing them with the kind of detached interest one might give to an interesting problem requiring analysis. "No," she said simply. "That's not how this works. I have a schedule. I honor my commitments to my customers. You'll wait your turn or you'll take your bike elsewhere." Shaved Head moved toward her, his posture aggressive. He was tall, maybe 6'1", with the kind of physical bulk that came from weightlifting rather than functional strength. "You need to understand something, lady. We're the Blackjacks. Nobody tells us to wait." "I'm telling you," Riley replied, returning her attention to the brake assembly. "You can accept it or leave. Those are your options." "That's not very hospitable," Carson said, though his tone suggested he found the situation amusing rather than concerning. He was testing her, Riley understood. Testing to see if this new aggression from his younger crew members would provoke a different response than his own measured harassment had. "Hospitality is for friends," Riley said. "Your customers. You get professional service and respectful treatment. Anything beyond that isn't part of the transaction." The shaved-headed biker grabbed a wrench from her workbench and hurled it at the concrete floor near her feet. It clattered and bounced, coming to rest a few inches from her boot. He was watching her, waiting for her to react, to show fear, to show anger, to show anything that might indicate he'd gotten under her skin. Riley looked at the wrench. Then she looked at him. Her expression didn't change. "That wrench is a snap-on, 3/8 inch precision calibrated," she said in the same neutral tone. "It costs $187. You're going to pick it up, and you're going to replace it with a new one of identical specifications. You can bring cash or a card. I don't extend credit to customers who damage my equipment." For a moment, nobody moved. The dynamics of dominance had inverted in ways the Blackjacks weren't accustomed to encountering. They were used to people backing down, giving in, showing deference. Riley's refusal to acknowledge the threat, her focus on the transactional rather than the personal, her absolute lack of fear, it created a vacuum where the biker's expected power should have been. "You're lucky I don't beat the shit out of you right now," the shaved-headed man said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "No," Riley corrected him. "I'm not lucky. You're lucky. Because if you did, it would create complications neither of us needs. I'd have to call the police. You'd have an assault charge. Your club would face potential liability. Your president would be disappointed with you for creating a legal problem over what amounts to professional disagreement." She gestured toward the door with her chin. "Now, you can either address the wrench situation or you can leave. I have work to do." Carson Devon watched this exchange with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his approach. The younger members of the club looked uncertain, their aggression meeting something they hadn't encountered before. Absolute professional boundary enforcement without emotion, without fear, without any indication that physical intimidation held any power. After a long moment, Shaved Head turned and walked toward the door, followed by the other two new members. "We'll be back," he said over his shoulder. "You're welcome to return," Riley replied, still focused on her work, "when you're ready to schedule legitimate service or address the wrench replacement." When they were gone, Carson lingered for a moment, studying Riley with an expression that had shifted from amusement to something more contemplative. "You're not like most women," he finally said. "No," Riley agreed. "I'm not. That's going to be a problem," he added. He left without another word, taking the remaining Blackjacks with him. Riley returned to the Indian Scout's brakes, her hands steady, her breathing unchanged, her focus absolute. But in the corner of her mind, she was already reassessing. The conflict was entering a new phase, and Marcus Holloway's arrival that morning, his knowledge of the situation, his offer of assistance, suddenly seemed far less coincidental than it had seemed 6 hours ago. The question was no longer whether she needed help. The question was whether she could afford to accept it. Riley didn't sleep that night. She lay in her apartment above the defunct insurance office, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Northridge settling into darkness. The radiator in the corner hissed and clanked. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The wind pressed against the windows with the kind of persistence that suggested a cold front moving in from the mountains. She thought about Marcus Holloway. She thought about his hands and his eyes and the way he'd said, "I'm aware that you're handling it alone, which is both admirable and dangerous." She thought about the Bonneville sitting in her shop, waiting to be resurrected. She thought about Carson Devon's final comment, "That's going to be a problem." At 4:47 a.m., Riley gave up on sleep. She showered, dressed in her standard work clothes, made her ritualistic weak coffee, and headed to the shop. The streets of Northridge were empty at this hour, the few streetlights casting pools of amber into the pre-dawn darkness. The mountains loomed to the west, massive and indifferent, the same way they'd loomed for millions of years before humans ever decided to build towns at their base. Maverick's Edge was dark when she arrived. She unlocked the main bay doors, disabled the alarm system, and flipped the switches that brought the overhead lights to life. The warehouse illuminated in sections, revealing the Bonneville still on her trailer, waiting. Riley had spent 20 years not thinking about her past. 20 years of compartmentalization, of deliberate forgetting, of constructing a life that bore no connection to the person she'd been before Colorado. But Marcus Holloway's arrival had begun to crack that careful architecture. She'd been sitting at her desk with her first cup of coffee when he appeared at the shop entrance at 6:15 a.m., 28 minutes earlier than their scheduled meeting. He was alone, carrying a leather folder under one arm and an expression of carefully controlled concern. "You didn't sleep," he said. "It wasn't a question." "How would you know that?" Riley replied, though she knew the answer. "Because I recognize the pattern. I'm familiar with the inability to rest when someone has disrupted your carefully maintained equilibrium." He set the folder on her desk without asking permission. "We need to talk about what I actually am, and why I'm really here." "I thought you were here to restore a motorcycle," Riley said. "That's the honest reason," Marcus replied, taking a seat without being invited. "But it's not the complete reason. And at this point, you deserve the complete reason." He opened the folder. Inside were photographs, dozens of them arranged chronologically. The first showed a younger Marcus in military dress uniform, standing beside a group of soldiers in desert camouflage. The next showed him receiving a medal from a general whose face Riley recognized from news broadcasts. Subsequent photos documented his progression through various military settings, various command positions, various moments of formal recognition. But it was the final photograph that made Riley's breath catch. It showed Marcus standing in front of a military facility in what looked like Afghanistan or Iraq, some desert landscape that could have been either region. Standing beside him was a woman. Riley only saw her from behind, but the bearing was unmistakable, the posture rigid with the particular discipline of special operations training. The woman was Riley herself, 20 years younger, but unmistakably her, wearing the uniform of the United States Army. "I don't know what you're talking about," Riley said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "Yes, you do," Marcus replied quietly. "You were Lieutenant Riley Vasquez, Delta Force, for the better part of 2 decades. You served in 12 countries. You led operations that remain classified. You received citations for valor that will likely never be public record. You were part of something larger than yourself, something that required every ounce of discipline and capability you possessed." Riley stood abruptly, the chair scraping backward. "Whoever you've been talking to." "I haven't been talking to anyone," Marcus interrupted. "I was your commanding officer. Not directly, you were always in the field, always reporting through chains of command that kept you compartmentalized. But I oversaw the operations you participated in. I reviewed your after-action reports. I recommended you for the command track. I watched you transform from an exceptional soldier into an exceptional leader." The shop suddenly felt too small. The walls seemed to contract. Riley moved toward the nearest workbench and braced her hands against it, needing the physical contact with something solid. "That was a different life," she finally said. "It was your real life," Marcus corrected. "This," he gestured around the shop, "is the life you've constructed since. And it's a good life. You've built something legitimate, something meaningful. But it's also a shelter. It's a place where you've been hiding from who you actually are. I'm not hiding, Riley said, though even she didn't believe it. You are, Marcus said with absolute certainty. And I understand why. The kind of work we do, the kind of work you did, it changes you. Takes away your ability to relate to normal life, normal problems, normal people. The violence becomes normal. The responsibility becomes crushing. The losses accumulate until they're heavier than anything a human being should have to carry alone. He paused, letting the words settle. After my last command, I spent 4 years unable to function in civilian settings. I couldn't watch movies with violence in them. I couldn't sit in crowded spaces. I couldn't maintain relationships because every person in my life seemed fragile, seemed temporary, seemed like they could be taken away at any moment. I eventually got help, therapy, medication, time, but I never stopped being a soldier. I just learned to be a soldier in different ways. Riley turned to face him. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand that I recognize what you're carrying, Marcus said. And because I need to tell you about why I'm actually here. He stood and moved to the window overlooking the shop floor, where the Bonneville sat waiting. 3 weeks ago, I received information that a former operative, someone I once worked with closely, was living in Northridge, Colorado, under an assumed life. The information came through channels I still maintain in certain circles. I was surprised, concerned, because I knew that if you were living quietly in a small town, it was because something had happened that made you decide to step away from the work. That's not your concern, Riley said. It is, actually, Marcus replied, because 5 days ago, I received additional information. Carson Devon, the man harassing you, isn't simply a motorcycle club president with an ego problem. He's connected to trafficking operations, human trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking. He has connections to organizations that operate internationally. And he's been in Northridge for a reason. Marcus turned from the window. He came here looking for you. He somehow discovered your location and your identity, and he's been testing your responses, gauging your capabilities, determining whether you're still operational or whether you've truly stepped away from the work. The room tilted slightly. Riley braced herself against the workbench. How is that possible? She asked. Because operational security can only hold for so long, Marcus said. Because digital trails exist despite our best efforts to erase them. Because someone, somewhere, decided that the information about your location was valuable enough to share with people who shouldn't have it. He returned to the desk and retrieved something from the folder. A printed email chain. This is intercepted communication between Carson Devon and someone operating out of Eastern Europe. They're discussing you specifically. They're discussing the potential for recruiting you or eliminating you, depending on your current operational status. Riley read the emails, her mind processing the information with the clarity that came from 20 years of intelligence analysis. The implication was clear. Her past had found her. The carefully constructed separation between who she'd been and who she'd become was collapsing. Why would they want to recruit me? She asked. I'm retired. Because exceptional people never truly retire, Marcus said. They simply go dormant. And certain organizations believe they can reactivate you. If that fails, they believe you're a liability who knows too much. So what do you want from me? Riley asked, though she was beginning to understand. I want to help you understand the situation you're actually in, Marcus replied. I want to provide you with resources and support while you decide how to respond. And I want to remind you that you don't have to face this alone. He moved toward the door, then paused. The Bonneville is real. The restoration work is genuine. But it's also cover for something more important. Establishing a presence here that provides legitimate reason for my continued involvement in your life. Because Riley, whatever you decide to do about Carson Devon and the organizations backing him, you're not going to handle it the way you've been handling everything else. Which is how? Riley asked, though she already knew the answer. Alone, Marcus said. And that's the part that ends now. He left before Riley could respond, the shop door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire warehouse like a period at the end of a sentence that changed everything. Riley spent the next 3 days pretending that Marcus Holloway's revelations hadn't fundamentally altered her understanding of her situation. She worked on the Indian Scouts breaks. She processed paperwork for a restoration job on a vintage Ducati. She maintained her routines with the kind of obsessive precision that suggested normalcy was still possible if she simply refused to acknowledge the cracks in the foundation. But the cracks were spreading. On Thursday evening, she received a phone call on the shop's landline, a number she'd published in limited places, used primarily for business inquiries. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but it carried the particular cadence of someone accustomed to delivering threats without raising their volume. "Riley Vasquez?" the voice asked. "Speaking," she replied, keeping her tone professionally neutral. "I'm calling on behalf of certain interested parties. We're aware of your previous employment history. We're also aware that you've chosen to separate yourself from that work. That's acceptable. However, we're equally aware that you possess significant knowledge about operations, personnel, and organizational structures that could be valuable to organizations willing to pay for such information." Riley's hand tightened on the phone receiver. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," the voice continued without inflection. "We're prepared to offer you $100,000 for a meeting. Just a conversation. No commitment beyond listening to a proposal. If you're interested, you'll meet with representatives at the address we're about to provide. If you're not interested, well, that creates a different set of complications." The caller provided an address, a warehouse facility 20 miles outside of Northridge, near the industrial area where the Interstate intersected with State Highway 85. Then the line went dead. Riley stood in her office for a long time, the dead phone line humming against her ear. She was aware, with the clinical precision of someone trained in threat assessment, that she'd just crossed a significant threshold. The testing phase was over. The Blackjack's harassment had been the visible component of something much larger. A coordinated effort to determine her status, her willingness to be manipulated, and her current operational capacity. She didn't tell Marcus Holloway about the phone call. What she did do was review her weapons. She kept a limited arsenal in a secure safe in her apartment. A 9mm Sig Sauer she'd maintained since her military days, a Mossberg shotgun, an AR-15 platform rifle she'd assembled herself. She checked each weapon's functionality, verified ammunition supplies, ensured that muscle memory remained intact despite years of civilian distance from the work. She also did something else. She called a number she'd kept memorized for 18 years, a number that should have been disconnected, a number that belonged to someone who'd been part of her operational team during her final assignment. The person who answered on the second ring was named David Reeves. He'd been her team's primary communications specialist, the person responsible for coordinating intelligence feeds during high-risk operations. When Riley had separated from service, Reeves had remained active for another 3 years before taking a position with a private security firm. "Riley," he said, surprise evident in his voice, "I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." "I need information," she said without preamble. "Current status of the trafficking network that operated out of Eastern Europe during our last deployment cycle. Specifically, any expansion into the American interior." There was a long pause. Then, "That's compartmentalized information. You know I can't." "You can," Riley interrupted, "because you're going to tell me that you don't officially know anything. But you're also going to make an informal call to someone who owes you a favor, who works in intelligence analysis, and you're going to ask them to review a pattern. And that person is going to notice that a particular trafficking organization has been establishing presence in secondary markets across the Rocky Mountain region." Another pause. Then, "Why are you asking this?" "Because I think they've found me," Riley said. "And I need to know if that was random or orchestrated." "Where are you?" David asked. "Northridge, Colorado. Running a motorcycle repair shop. Living quietly." David made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a curse. "And they found you anyway. That's concerning. Let me make some calls. I'll contact you in 24 hours. The next morning, the Blackjacks arrived in force. Not the usual contingent, but the full roster, 23 men in leather and chrome. Their motorcycles arranged in a deliberate tactical pattern that blocked all exits from the shop. Carson Devon was among them, but so were 2 men Riley hadn't seen before. These men wore the kind of bearing that transcended motorcycle club affiliation. They moved like operators, like people accustomed to violence as a professional tool rather than a personal expression. Devon approached her directly. Riley was working on the Ducati's electrical system, her hands steady, her focus seemingly absolute. "We need to talk," Devon said. His tone was different now, less aggressive, more businesslike. "Schedule an appointment," Riley replied without looking up. "Not about the bikes," Devon continued. "About your previous career. About the people you used to work for. About the conversation you had on your shop phone 3 days ago." Riley set down her tools slowly. She turned to face him, her expression neutral, her body language utterly controlled. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. One of the unfamiliar men stepped forward. He was lean, perhaps 50, with the particular quality of someone who'd spent significant time in intelligence operations. "Ms. Vasquez, we're authorized to make a formal recruitment offer on behalf of organizations operating throughout the Western Hemisphere. We're aware of your background, your capabilities, and your current civilian status. We have a contract that would compensate you substantially for specific services." "I'm not interested," Riley said simply. "You haven't heard the details," the man replied. "I don't need to," Riley said. "I'm not available for contract work. I'm not available for consultation. I'm not available for anything beyond what I'm currently doing. Operating a legitimate business and maintaining civilian life." The second unfamiliar man moved closer. He was larger than his colleague, perhaps 6'2", with the particular physical presence of someone trained in close-quarters combat. "People don't walk away from this kind of work and expect to remain unmolested," he said. "There are protocols. There are procedures. You can't simply vanish and pretend you never existed." "Watch me," Riley said. Something flickered across the larger man's face. A recognition of her absolute certainty, her complete lack of fear or negotiation. He exchanged a glance with his colleague, and in that moment, the dynamic shifted from recruitment toward something darker. "Then we need to discuss your elimination," the first man said with the kind of matter-of-fact tone one might use to discuss weather. "You represent a liability. You possess classified information. You've demonstrated an unwillingness to cooperate with reasonable business proposals. That leaves only one viable option." "On what authority?" Riley asked, though she already knew the answer. "On the authority of organizations that don't require democratic legitimacy or legal framework," the man replied. "We represent interests that operate beyond the jurisdiction of American law enforcement." He gestured to the blackjacks. The 23 men began moving toward her in a coordinated pattern that suggested tactical planning. They weren't attempting to appear casual or intimidating through mere presence. They were establishing a physical encirclement designed to prevent escape and enable rapid execution. Riley's mind operated with the crystalline clarity that came from 2 decades of high-stakes training. She evaluated the exits, blocked. She assessed the available weapons in the shop, the tools scattered across workbenches, the wrench set hanging on the wall, the pneumatic equipment connected to compressed air lines. She calculated distances, timing, the probable response patterns of men trained in coordinated violence. And she made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of fighting, instead of attempting to break through the perimeter or access her weapons, Riley simply said, "You should probably know that Marcus Holloway is aware of this situation, and that he's currently positioned with tactical equipment approximately 200 yards from this facility." The first man's expression didn't change. The second man's hand moved slightly toward an interior pocket, a gesture that suggested he was reaching for communication equipment or a weapon. "That would be unfortunate," the first man said. "For Mr. Holloway." "No," Riley corrected him. "It would be unfortunate for you, because Marcus Holloway isn't here in an advisory capacity. He's here because I called him approximately 4 hours ago and informed him that I'd received recruitment contact from hostile foreign intelligence operatives, because I provided him with the warehouse address I was given, and because he brought resources that include federal law enforcement coordination." It was partially a bluff. Marcus had positioned surveillance equipment, but the extent of federal involvement was ambiguous. However, the first man's sudden hesitation, the way he exchanged a glance with his colleague, suggested that he was calculating odds that had suddenly shifted dramatically. The blackjacks had begun to recognize that something was wrong. The coordinated energy of the encirclement began to fragment into confusion and uncertainty. "We're going to leave now," the first man said carefully. "But understand, this isn't over. You've made a significant mistake by choosing to resist cooperation." "No," Riley said quietly. "The mistake was coming to my shop. The mistake was thinking that I'd separated myself so completely from my previous capabilities that I wouldn't recognize recruitment protocols when I encountered them. The mistake was assuming that the woman you found would be the same person you were looking for." She stepped forward, her movement slow and deliberate, her eyes locked on the first man's face. "I left the work because I needed to separate myself from that version of myself," Riley continued. "But that separation isn't erasure. It's dormancy, and dormancy can end very quickly when threatened." For a moment, nothing moved in the shop. The air hung thick and expectant, as if the space itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Then the first man turned and walked toward the exit. The second man followed. The blackjacks, uncertain and now understanding that they were merely muscle being used for something larger than they'd anticipated, gradually dispersed. Carson Devon lingered for a moment, meeting Riley's eyes with an expression that suggested genuine confusion about who she actually was. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I know," Riley replied. "That's why you're still alive." When the shop was finally empty, Riley stood alone amid the motorcycles and tools and the carefully maintained machinery of her civilian life. The barrier between who she'd been and who she'd tried to become had been irrevocably breached. There was no returning to the comfortable obscurity of Northridge, Colorado. The past had arrived, demanded recognition, and forced a choice. And Riley had chosen exactly what she swore she would never choose again. She picked up the phone and called Marcus Holloway. "They came," she said when he answered. "I know," Marcus replied. "I'm observing the aftermath. Are you injured?" "No," Riley said. "But we need to talk about what comes next. And I think you already know what that is." "I do," Marcus confirmed. "But I'll let you say it." Riley took a breath, feeling the weight of 20 years of separation beginning to lift, feeling the particular clarity that came from surrendering to inevitability. "I need to go back to work," she said quietly. Marcus Holloway arrived at Riley's apartment at 11:47 p.m., carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of expression that suggested he'd already made decisions about her future before she'd officially agreed to anything. Riley had unlocked the door at his knock, stepping aside to allow him entry into the modest living space that had become her sanctuary for the past 3 years. The apartment was sparse: a bed, a small kitchen, a living area with minimal furniture. The walls were bare except for a single landscape photograph of the Rocky Mountains at sunset. There were no personal items, no photographs of friends or family, no indication that anyone actually lived here beyond the basic requirements of survival. Marcus noted all of this with a glance, then moved to the small kitchen table and opened his briefcase. "First, we need to establish parameters," he said, laying out a series of documents. "What you're agreeing to isn't a return to active military service. The Army Medical Board discharged you with full benefits based on psychological evaluation. That discharge is permanent. What you're agreeing to is contract work with a private organization that operates with federal oversight but operates outside traditional military command structures." "A private military company," Riley said. "It wasn't a question." "A specialized consulting firm," Marcus corrected. "We contract with federal agencies, state law enforcement, and international partners to address security situations that require discrete solutions and operational flexibility. The pay is substantially higher than military service. The risks are comparable. The legal protections are more limited." He slid a contract across the table. It was dense with legal language, carefully constructed to protect the organization while providing Riley with certain guarantees regarding compensation, medical care, and pension contributions. "You'll need to read this," Marcus said, "carefully, and you need to understand that once you sign, you're committing to a minimum 5-year contract with 60% of your compensation tied to successful operational completion and 60% dependent on performance ratings. Riley began reading, her eyes moving across the document with the kind of focused intensity that came from 2 decades of reviewing operational briefings and intelligence reports. The contract outlined her responsibilities: tactical operations, intelligence gathering, threat assessment, team leadership. It outlined her authority, significant, but always subordinate to overall mission command. It outlined the situations where the organization would provide legal representation and the situations where they would not. What about the situation with the trafficking network? Riley asked, not looking up from the contract. That's why we're accelerating your recruitment, Marcus said. He retrieved a file from his briefcase and placed it beside the contract. David Reeves provided us with intelligence confirming that the Eastern European Trafficking Organization has been systematically expanding throughout North America. They've established operations in 12 states. They're moving significant quantities of human cargo and contraband materials. And they've clearly identified you as either an asset to be acquired or a liability to be eliminated. Why would they want me specifically? Riley asked. It's been 18 years since my last operational assignment. Because people in trafficking operations talk, Marcus explained. Because your name appears in classified after-action reports from operations targeting their predecessor organizations. Because there are individuals within their network who remember you from previous encounters. And because exceptional operators never truly disappear, their reputation persists, and that reputation makes them valuable. Riley continued reading, processing the contract's implications. The compensation structure suggested annual salary in the range of $350,000, with performance bonuses potentially doubling that amount. The operational expectations suggested deployments lasting 3 to 6 months at a time. The psychological evaluation requirements suggested that her previous discharge hadn't actually been about capability. It had been about institutional politics and bureaucratic convenience. Why was I actually discharged? She asked, setting the contract down and looking directly at Marcus. The official report said psychological evaluation, but that was never the real reason. Marcus met her gaze steadily. Because you became difficult to manage. Because your operational success rate was creating jealousy among senior leadership. Because your gender was becoming a political liability in a military culture that wasn't ready for the implications of your capability. And because after your final deployment, you made it clear that you were psychologically withdrawing from the work regardless of what institutional support we could provide. So they discharged me to avoid managing a crisis, Riley said flatly. Yes, Marcus confirmed, which was a mistake. You should have been retained, promoted, and given command of a full operational unit. But institutional politics prevented that outcome, and you made the decision to separate yourself voluntarily rather than fight for recognition that would likely have been withheld anyway. Riley stood and moved to the window overlooking Northridge's empty streets. It was nearly midnight, and the town had settled into the kind of silence that only small communities in rural mountain regions could achieve. The streetlights created pools of illumination in the darkness, and beyond the lights, the mountains loomed like ancient sentinels. If I do this, she said slowly, what happens to Maverick's Edge? The shop transfers to a management company that handles it as a legitimate operation, Marcus said. You maintain ownership, but day-to-day operations are handled by contract employees. Provides income without requiring your presence. It also provides cover for your operational activities, a reason for your periodic absences from Northridge, a legitimate business address, a functional life that people in the community can understand and accept. And the Bonneville? Riley asked. Restoration continues, Marcus said, but at an accelerated pace. You have 4 weeks before your first operational deployment. The contract includes a provision requiring you to complete any restoration work committed to before engagement begins. Riley turned from the window. 4 weeks to prepare for reactivation as an operator? That's not sufficient time for proper tactical training or mission briefing. No, Marcus agreed, which is why your first assignment is a training assignment. It's not a combat operation. It's a supervised deployment designed to reestablish operational protocols and assess your current capability level. And what if I'm not where I used to be physically or mentally? Riley asked. Then we work with that reality, Marcus said. You'll undergo a week of comprehensive evaluation, physical fitness assessment, psychological screening, tactical capability testing. Based on those evaluations, your first assignment will be calibrated to address any deficiencies that have developed during your 18 years of separation. Riley returned to the table and picked up the contract again. She read through the remaining pages, her mind processing the implications, the commitment, the fundamental change in her existence that this document represented. "What's the trafficking operation's immediate timeline?" she asked. "They're planning a major movement operation 3 weeks from now," Marcus said, "coordinating the transport of approximately 80 individuals through a distribution network that runs through Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. We have intelligence suggesting they're using routes that pass through Northridge, which is why they wanted to recruit or eliminate you. Your presence represented either a resource or an obstacle. And my assignment? Gather intelligence on their local operations," Marcus said. "Identify key personnel and distribution points. Provide tactical recommendations for disruption of their network. You won't be making arrests. That's law enforcement's responsibility. You'll be providing information and threat assessment. And if they target me again, then you have authorization to defend yourself with force necessary to ensure your survival and mission success," Marcus said. "Full legal protection contingent on your actions remaining proportional to the threat posed." Riley set the contract down and retrieved a pen from a drawer in her small kitchen. She returned to the table and reviewed the final pages one more time, then signed her name with a clarity of purpose that surprised her. The signature committed her to something that her 18 years of civilian life had been designed to prevent. It committed her back to the work, back to the violence, back to the particular moral compromises that came with operating in spaces where law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't venture. But it also committed her to something else. A response to the trafficking network that had threatened her life, a way of converting the forced reactivation into a choice, a method of transforming her vulnerability into agency. "When do I start the evaluation?" she asked, sliding the signed contract across the table. "Tomorrow morning," Marcus said, collecting the contract. "There's a facility about 90 minutes from here, a private training complex in the mountains. You'll report at 0600 hours. Bring minimal personal items. The facility will provide everything else you need." "What about the shop?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'll coordinate the transfer to management," Marcus said. "I'll also ensure that your apartment is maintained and that utilities continue uninterrupted. To the community, you're simply taking an extended personal leave, a sabbatical, perhaps, or a family situation requiring your attention." Riley nodded. The practical details were being managed with the kind of efficiency that suggested Marcus had anticipated her agreement and prepared contingencies accordingly. "There's something else you need to understand," Marcus continued, his expression becoming more serious. "Reactivation doesn't mean you return to who you were 18 years ago. You've changed. The world has changed. The operational landscape has changed. What you're going back to is different than what you left." "In what ways?" Riley asked. "In ways that you'll discover during the evaluation and training phases," Marcus said. "But primarily the work is more lethal now. The adversaries are more sophisticated. The organizational structures are more complex. And the psychological cost of operations is higher because we ask for more creativity, more improvisation, more personal investment in outcomes." He stood, preparing to leave. "Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow begins the process of determining whether the woman who built Maverick's Edge has the capacity to become something more than what she's become." "I already know I do," Riley said quietly. "Yes," Marcus agreed. "But you need to prove it to yourself. That's the only validation that matters." After he left, Riley sat alone in her apartment, the signed contract still visible on the table where he'd left it. She looked at her signature, the careful, precise lettering that had always been her standard. 18 years of separation from the work, and it had taken only a single threat to convince her that the separation had always been temporary. The woman who had built a motorcycle repair shop in a small Colorado town and tried to disappear from her past had made a choice. She'd chosen to step back into the darkness, to reclaim the identity she'd spent nearly 2 decades trying to escape, to become again what she'd been trained to be. And in that moment, sitting alone in the sparse apartment, Riley understood that she'd never really stopped being an operator. She'd only been dormant, waiting for circumstances to activate her again. Tomorrow would be the first step toward confirming what she'd always known, that some people don't get to choose civilian life. Some people are instruments of a particular kind of necessary violence, and the only choice available to them is whether they use that instrument in service of something meaningful or allow it to rust unused. Riley had made her choice. The facility was called Blackstone Ridge Training Complex, though the official designation on the government contracts it maintained was something far more obscure and classified. It sat deep in the mountains approximately 90 minutes northwest of Northridge, accessible only by a private road that wound through dense forest and gradually increased in elevation until the surrounding terrain became alpine meadow and rocky peaks. Riley arrived at 5:58 a.m. in a vehicle that Marcus had arranged, a nondescript SUV that had been parked outside her apartment building with keys in the ignition. The drive had given her time to think about what she was about to undergo, though thinking about it and experiencing it would prove to be two entirely different things. The complex itself was modest in appearance, a series of low buildings constructed from stone and steel, designed to blend into the surrounding landscape rather than dominate it. A perimeter fence suggested security concerns, though the fence was less about preventing escape and more about preventing casual observation. The parking area contained perhaps 24 vehicles, suggesting a facility that operated with a relatively small permanent staff despite managing multiple operational assignments. A woman named Sarah Chun, no relation to the individuals Marcus had warned her about, but operating with similar professional bearing, met Riley at the main entrance. Sarah was mid-50s with the kind of physical presence that suggested decades of dedicated training. Her hair was steel gray, pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes were intelligent and assessing, the eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating capability. "Welcome to Blackstone Ridge," Sarah said, offering her hand. Riley shook it, noting the calluses and the firm grip. This woman had done the work herself, not simply supervised others doing it. "I'm the head of operational evaluation. You'll be under my direct supervision during the assessment phase. Marcus briefed you on timeline. For weeks before first deployment," Riley confirmed. 1 week of comprehensive evaluation. "Correct," Sarah said, gesturing for Riley to follow her into the facility. "The evaluation will assess 3 primary domains: physical capability, tactical proficiency, and psychological readiness. We'll be testing where you are now, not comparing you to where you were 18 years ago. That distinction is important." They moved through corridors that were utilitarian and clean, no excessive decoration, no attempts at comfort beyond basic functionality. The facility had the particular quality of spaces designed for serious work, spaces where distractions were minimized and focus was maximized. Sarah led her to a residential area where she was assigned a small room, bed, desk, bathroom, nothing more. "You'll have 16 hours each day here," Sarah explained. 8 hours of formal evaluation, 3 hours of meals and personal maintenance, 5 hours of rest. The remaining time is yours to use as you see fit. "What about communication with the outside?" Riley asked. "Limited," Sarah said. "You can make 1 phone call per day, but all communications are monitored. No internet access, no news media. The goal is to minimize external distractions and maintain focus on the evaluation process." Riley set down her minimal luggage. She'd packed only what Marcus had suggested: changes of clothes, toiletries, a notebook. No technology, no devices, nothing that might create connection to her previous life. "Physical evaluation starts in 1 hour," Sarah continued. "You'll find athletic gear in the closet. Meet me at the gymnasium." The gymnasium was a large open space with equipment scattered throughout: weights, cardio machines, obstacle courses, climbing walls, rope systems suspended from the ceiling. A younger man was already present, clearly one of the staff members assigned to conduct the evaluation. What followed was 6 hours of continuous physical testing. They measured Riley's cardiovascular capacity through progressively intense running protocols on a treadmill. They assessed her strength through weighted exercises, squats, deadlifts, bench press, overhead press. They tested her functional movement patterns, crawling, climbing, carrying, sprinting. They measured her flexibility, her balance, her proprioceptive awareness. By hour 3, Riley's muscles were screaming. By hour 5, her mind was beginning to fragment into the particular state of consciousness that came only from physical exhaustion approaching systemic failure. By hour 6, she was operating purely on discipline and refusal to quit. Sarah observed all of this without comment, making notes on a clipboard, her expression revealing nothing. When the physical testing concluded, Riley was taken to medical for blood work, body composition analysis, and a comprehensive physical examination conducted by a doctor who operated with clinical efficiency and zero concern for her comfort. The psychological evaluation began the next morning and lasted 3 full days. It included traditional intelligence testing, pattern recognition, problem-solving, information retention. It included personality assessment through questionnaires designed to measure stability, reliability, and psychological resilience. It included stress interviews where Sarah asked deliberately provocative questions designed to elicit emotional responses. "Why did you leave the work?" Sarah asked during one particularly intense session. "Because I needed separation," Riley replied. "That's not an answer," Sarah said. "That's an evasion. Why did you actually leave?" Riley considered the question carefully. "Because the cumulative weight of the decisions I'd made, the people I'd ordered into dangerous situations, the people who hadn't come back, that weight reached a point where I couldn't sustain it without experiencing psychological breakdown. Leaving wasn't about the work being too hard. It was about the work requiring me to make decisions that violated my core values regarding the sanctity of human life." Sarah made a note. "And now? Do you believe you can operate again without experiencing that same psychological deterioration?" "No," Riley said honestly. "I believe the weight will still accumulate. But I also believe that the situation with the trafficking network represents an opportunity to apply my capability towards something that matters in ways my previous work didn't always matter." "Stopping trafficking?" Sarah asked. "That's a motivation?" "Stopping the people who profit from the reduction of other human beings to commodities?" Riley said. "Yes, that's a motivation I can sustain." The tactical evaluation took place over 3 days and involved scenarios designed to assess Riley's ability to plan and execute complex operations under pressure. She was given intelligence briefings on fictional hostile scenarios and asked to develop tactical approaches. She was placed in simulated environments and required to make real-time decisions under time pressure and incomplete information. She was placed in scenarios where her decisions directly affected the survival of role-played team members. One scenario involved extraction of a civilian from a hostile environment. Riley developed a plan that prioritized the civilian's safety but required accepting significant personal risk. When the simulation ended and the evaluation team debriefed the scenario, Sarah asked why Riley had accepted that risk distribution. "Because the civilian's life has intrinsic value regardless of operational cost," Riley said. "My life has value only insofar as I can effectively use it to protect others." "That's a recipe for martyrdom," Sarah said. "It's a framework for making decisions when outcomes are inherently tragic," Riley replied. "If I'm going to operate again, I need a value system that allows me to accept the moral weight of operational decisions. That value system prioritizes protection of those unable to protect themselves." By the end of the evaluation week, Riley was physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and psychologically tested in ways that had revealed both her strengths and her vulnerabilities. Sarah delivered the assessment results in a formal briefing conducted in a small conference room. "Physically, you're in good condition for your age," Sarah said, reviewing her notes. "Your cardiovascular capacity is excellent. Your strength levels are adequate, though you show some muscle loss from your baseline 18 years ago. Your mobility and flexibility are better than 90% of operators we evaluate. With focused training, you'll regain full physical capacity within 8 weeks." She flipped to the next page. "Psychologically, you present as stable, resilient, and appropriately motivated. Your stress response patterns are healthy. You process anxiety through analysis rather than avoidance. Your decision-making framework is clear and values-based. However, you show some indicators of lingering trauma from your final deployment that haven't fully resolved during your civilian separation. What kind of trauma indicators? Riley asked. Hypervigilance in certain contexts, slight elevation in baseline anxiety, and what appears to be unprocessed grief regarding personnel losses, Sarah said. None of this precludes operational deployment, but it does suggest that you'll benefit from ongoing psychological support during your operational reactivation. She looked up from her notes. Tactically, you're exceptional. Your planning is comprehensive, your decision-making is sound, and your ability to adapt to unexpected scenarios is remarkable. You show the particular capability that comes from extensive real-world operational experience, the ability to recognize patterns and anticipate consequences in ways that pure training can't develop. What's your recommendation? Riley asked. That you're ready for operational deployment, Sarah said. Your first assignment should be the intelligence gathering operation regarding the trafficking network. It's low intensity relative to what you're capable of, but it's appropriate for your current reactivation status. It will allow you to rebuild operational muscle memory and confidence before more demanding assignments. She closed the folder. Marcus will provide you with specific mission briefings and deployment details, but from my perspective, you're cleared for operational status. Welcome back, Commander. The word struck Riley like a physical blow. She hadn't been called Commander in 18 years. It was the title of her final rank before separation, the title that had never been fully accepted by a military institution that couldn't quite reconcile her gender with her capability. Over the next 3 weeks, Riley underwent intensive tactical training designed to modernize her skill set. Weapons systems had evolved. Communication technology had advanced. Operational protocols had adapted to account for modern surveillance and intelligence gathering capabilities. She spent days in live-fire ranges, reacquainting herself with weapons systems she'd once known intimately. She spent hours in simulation environments practicing scenarios that incorporated current threat patterns. She underwent training in new surveillance equipment, modern encryption systems, and updated tactical protocols. And with each day of training, something shifted in her consciousness. The civilian identity she'd carefully constructed was gradually being displaced by the operational identity she'd worked to suppress. The woman who ran a motorcycle repair shop was becoming secondary to the commander who made tactical decisions and led operational teams. By the 3rd week, Sarah called her into a final session. How are you feeling about the reactivation process? Sarah asked. Uncertain, Riley admitted. I spent 18 years becoming someone else, and it's taking only 3 weeks to dismantle that identity. That's normal, Sarah said. Operational identity is reinforced by practice and decision-making. Civilian identity is reinforced primarily by routine and isolation. When you reintroduce the operational context, the operational identity reasserts itself naturally. Does that mean I'm losing who I've become? Riley asked. No, Sarah said. It means you're integrating. The woman who built Maverick's edge, her values, her discipline, her refusal to accept easy answers, those qualities remain. They're just being expressed through a different operational framework. Riley nodded slowly, accepting the assessment even though it felt incomplete. One more thing, Sarah said, retrieving a file from her desk. During your evaluation week, we ran background analysis on the trafficking organization you'll be targeting. We identified the specific individuals responsible for threatening your life. One of them was at your shop when Marcus's team was monitoring the situation. She opened the file, revealing photographs and intelligence summaries. The man who suggested your elimination, his name is Viktor Kowalski. He operates as a regional coordinator for the trafficking network. He's former Russian FSB, trained in interrogation and assassination. He's responsible for at least 19 confirmed deaths in North America over the past 6 years. He's likely responsible for more. Riley studied the photograph of Viktor Kowalski, mid-50s, scarred face, the bearing of someone accustomed to violence as both tool and solution. Your first operational objective involves gathering intelligence that will allow law enforcement to identify and prosecute Kowalski's organization, Sarah continued. But if circumstances require it, you have authorization to directly address the threat he represents. Riley understood what Sarah was saying. If neutralizing Kowalski became necessary for mission success or personal survival, the organization would provide legal cover for that decision. When do I deploy? Riley asked. Tomorrow, Sarah said. Marcus will provide specific briefing, but you should know that this isn't a theoretical operation. There will be real risk. There will be real consequences. This is operational deployment in every sense of the phrase. Riley nodded, feeling the particular clarity that came only when commitment shifted from intellectual acknowledgement to practical reality. 24 hours later, she was back in Northridge, back in her apartment above the defunct insurance office, beginning the process of reestablishing the cover that would allow her to gather intelligence on an organization that had threatened her life and was now threatening the lives of 80 people scheduled for transport through her region. The woman who had tried to escape her past was about to use that past to confront present darkness. The operational briefing took place in Riley's apartment at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Marcus arrived with a laptop, encrypted communication equipment, and a series of classified briefing documents. The apartment's sparse quality suddenly made sense. It was designed for exactly this kind of meeting, a space where there was nothing extraneous, nothing that could record conversations or capture details. The trafficking network you're targeting has 3 operational tiers in this region. Marcus began, displaying satellite imagery and organizational charts on the laptop screen. The bottom tier is street-level distribution, the blackjacks and similar motorcycle clubs who move product and identify potential victims. The middle tier is regional coordination. That's Victor Kowalski's responsibility. The top tier is international operations, which we're not directly targeting. He zoomed in on a map showing Northridge and the surrounding region. Red dots indicated known trafficking locations, yellow dots indicated suspected operations, and blue dots indicated intelligence gathering points. Your responsibility is to provide intelligence that allows federal law enforcement to dismantle the middle tier, Marcus continued. Specifically, you need to identify Kowalski's communication networks, his financial flows, his operational schedule, and his key personnel. That information will be provided to FBI field offices and Department of Homeland Security, who will handle the actual arrest and prosecution. What about the 80 individuals scheduled for transport? Riley asked. That's a separate operation, Marcus said. Law enforcement is handling interception. Your role is limited to intelligence gathering. The reason for that limitation is critical. If you become involved in direct rescue operations, you become a witness, you become exposed, and your operational identity becomes compromised. Riley understood the logic, but it created a cognitive dissonance. She'd trained to protect people in danger. Now she was being asked to gather intelligence about people in danger while allowing others to manage the actual protection. It was a different kind of operational engagement, but it felt like a separation from immediate responsibility. You're struggling with this, Marcus said, reading her expression accurately. I'm struggling with the fact that I could potentially save those 80 people directly, and instead I'm being kept at a distance from them, Riley admitted. Yes, Marcus said. That's the deeper lesson you need to learn from this operation. Operational effectiveness isn't about direct action. It's about understanding the broader context in which direct action becomes possible. He pulled up additional files showing the trafficking network structure, its supply chains, its financial mechanisms, its personnel relationships. During your previous operational career, you were focused on tactical execution, Marcus continued. You led teams, you made real-time decisions, you directly controlled outcomes. That work was valuable and necessary, but it was also limited by the scope of individual operations. You could rescue people in a specific location. You could eliminate a specific threat, but you couldn't address the systemic structures that created that threat in the first place. He displayed a photograph of a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair and haunted eyes. This is Elena Morales. She was trafficked through the network you're targeting. She was rescued 6 months ago by law enforcement acting on intelligence provided by an undercover operative embedded in a similar trafficking organization. That operative spent 4 months providing information. During those 4 months, Elena and 19 other people were successfully extracted before law enforcement moved on the operation. He pulled up another photograph, this one showing a young man in his late teens. This is Marcus Delgado. He was trafficked 2 years ago before current intelligence gathering operations existed. He wasn't rescued. He was murdered by his handlers when he became too difficult to control. His body was never recovered. His family still doesn't know what happened to him. Marcus closed the laptop. The difference between Elena's fate and Marcus's fate wasn't tactical capability or rescue operations. It was information. It was someone embedded in the organization providing intelligence that allowed law enforcement to identify, locate, and extract victims before they could be transported into deeper exploitation. Riley understood what he was saying intellectually, but understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were different processes. Your job isn't to rescue people, Marcus said directly. Your job is to provide information that allows law enforcement to rescue people at scale, across multiple operations, preventing trafficking before it becomes internment and death. That's a higher order of operational impact than direct action. How do I access that information? Riley asked, shifting into tactical mode to manage the emotional difficulty. Through Carson Devon, Marcus said. The Blackjacks aren't sophisticated operators, but they have direct contact with Kowalski's organization. They handle local sourcing and regional logistics. By embedding yourself deeper in their operational network, you gain access to communication channels, financial flows, and personnel information that Kowalski uses to coordinate his activities. You want me to penetrate the Blackjacks, Riley said, understanding the implication. Yes, Marcus confirmed. You'll gradually reestablish contact with Devon. You'll present yourself as reconsidering your position regarding contract work. You'll suggest that you're willing to provide operational consultation for the trafficking network, specifically regarding tactical security for transport operations and personnel safety protocols. That role will give you legitimate reason to interact with Kowalski and his personnel. What's my cover story for suddenly reversing my position? Riley asked. Financial desperation, Marcus said. Maverick's Edge is struggling. Operational costs are higher than expected. You need income beyond what the shop generates. You've had time to reconsider the recruitment offer, and now you're willing to negotiate. He displayed financial documentation showing the shop's accounts. Marcus had deliberately arranged for the contract management company to create a pattern of reduced profitability and increasing operational costs. The cover story is partially true, Marcus continued. The shop isn't actually struggling, but the documentation is legitimate. If Devon or Kowalski investigate, they'll find evidence supporting the financial pressure narrative. Riley reviewed the financial records. They were comprehensive and convincing: supplier invoices, equipment maintenance costs, property taxes, utilities. Everything documented to support the story that Maverick's Edge was becoming a financial burden. When do I make contact? Riley asked. After 4 days, Marcus said. You'll reach out to Devon through an intermediary contact. You'll suggest a meeting at a neutral location. You'll present your willingness to work with the organization in a limited consulting capacity. What happens if Kowalski decides I'm still a liability? Riley asked. Then you have authorization to defend yourself, Marcus said. The organization will have surveillance positioned to monitor the meeting. If the situation becomes immediately life-threatening, we'll provide extraction. But you should assume that any interaction with Kowalski's people will be hostile until proven otherwise. They spent the next 6 hours going through operational protocols. Riley reviewed photographs and intelligence profiles of the people she'd be interacting with. She studied communication procedures and security protocols. She learned the specific systems the trafficking network used for coordinating operations and managing personnel. By the time Marcus left her apartment at 8 a.m., Riley had absorbed the equivalent of a week's worth of intelligence briefing into her operational memory. But something else had shifted during that briefing. Something more fundamental than tactical knowledge. Over the next 4 days, Riley reconnected with her civilian identity deliberately. She opened Maverick's Edge normally. She worked on the Bonneville restoration. She went to Brennan's diner for coffee. She maintained the visible life of a woman struggling with financial pressures and considering options. And while maintaining that civilian identity, she also began the process of reaching out to the underworld. Through an intermediary contact provided by Marcus, a woman named Jessica Palmer who worked as a bartender and maintained connections across multiple criminal networks, Riley sent a message to Carson Devon. The message was simple. She wanted to discuss the earlier recruitment offer, and she was now willing to listen to proposals. Devon's response came within 3 hours. They arranged to meet at an abandoned warehouse facility 20 miles outside Northridge, neutral ground controlled by neither the Blackjacks nor any law enforcement agency. Riley drove there at dusk, her vehicle equipped with GPS tracking and an emergency communication device hidden in her jacket pocket. Devon was waiting with 2 bodyguards, men she recognized from previous encounters, neither of them the sophisticated operators from the earlier confrontation. "You've reconsidered," Devon said, his tone suggesting he'd known she would eventually. "I've reconsidered," Riley confirmed. "Maverick's edge isn't generating sufficient income. I have skills that command higher compensation. I'm willing to provide consulting services regarding security protocols and tactical planning." "What changed your mind?" one of the bodyguards asked. "Financial reality," Riley said. "Pride doesn't pay property taxes." Devon studied her with the kind of assessment that suggested he was looking for deception. "Kowalski will want to verify your sincerity. He won't trust you simply because you show up and express interest." "I understand," Riley said. "What kind of verification?" "A job," Devon said. "Small scale. Proving that you're willing to work with the organization and that you're capable of doing what you claim." "What kind of job?" "Route planning for a transport operation," Devon said. "We're moving merchandise through the state in 4 days. We need an experienced tactical operator to review our planned routes, identify security vulnerabilities, and suggest optimization. You do that successfully, Kowalski will meet with you directly and discuss expanded contract work." Riley processed the offer. A transport operation moving trafficking victims. Her job would be to help optimize the routes, which meant helping ensure that 80 people were moved more efficiently toward exploitation and potential death. "I'll need to review the routes and operational parameters," Riley said. "Kowalski will provide those," Devon confirmed. "This is just the preliminary discussion. Do you accept the assignment?" Riley understood in that moment what Marcus had meant about deeper lessons. She was being asked to do something that her moral framework violently rejected, to participate in the mechanics of human trafficking even in a limited consulting capacity. But she also understood that accepting the assignment was the only way to gather intelligence that would allow those 80 people to be rescued before being transported into deeper exploitation. "I accept," Riley said. When she returned to her apartment that night, the weight of that acceptance was almost physical. She'd just agreed to consult on a trafficking operation. She'd placed herself in a position where she would be reviewing documents, analyzing logistics, and providing expertise that would be used to move victims more efficiently. And she'd done it deliberately, knowing that the intelligence she gathered would eventually allow law enforcement to stop that movement and rescue those people. This was the deeper lesson Marcus had been teaching her. Operational effectiveness wasn't about personal heroics or direct confrontation with enemies. It was about understanding the broader context where individual actions could have systemic impact. It was about accepting the moral complexity of working within a system you were trying to dismantle. It was about the particular kind of courage it took to compromise your immediate moral instincts in service of a larger objective. Riley sat in her sparse apartment, looking out at the lights of Northridge, feeling the weight of operational responsibility settle onto her shoulders in a way that was different from her previous career. She had spent 18 years trying to escape the moral complexities of operational work. Now she was re-entering that world, not because she'd failed to escape, but because escaping had made her more valuable than she'd ever been. The woman who understood both sides, the civilian and the operational, the rescue and the systemic, the immediate and the strategic, was exactly the person the organization needed. And as Riley prepared for the documents Kowalski would provide, she understood that the real operational journey was just beginning. The transport operation documentation arrived at Riley's apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by Carson Devon himself. He handed her a sealed envelope containing operational maps, vehicle routing plans, personnel schedules, and financial transfer records. The envelope represented everything the federal government would need to dismantle Kowalski's organization, if Riley could deliver it without compromising her cover. "Kowalski expects your analysis within 48 hours, Devon said, standing in her living room with the particular quality of someone who'd been given authority beyond his usual parameters. "He wants to know if the routes are optimal, if there are security vulnerabilities, and if the timeline is realistic given current law enforcement monitoring capabilities. "I'll need to review everything thoroughly," Riley said, taking the envelope. 48 hours is tight for comprehensive analysis. "That's what Kowalski expects from someone claiming advanced tactical capability," Devon replied. 48 hours to prove your worth, the considerable compensation he's offering." After Devon left, Riley sat at her small kitchen table with the documents spread before her. The first document was a map showing the transport route, a complex path through 3 states, utilizing secondary highways and rural routes specifically selected to avoid major law enforcement checkpoints. The route began at a collection facility in Denver, proceeded through Wyoming, then entered Montana before dispersing into smaller transport networks. She photographed each document using a miniature camera provided by Marcus, devices small enough to fit in her palm, capable of producing high-resolution images that could be transmitted through encrypted channels. She worked methodically, photographing every page, every detail, building a comprehensive digital record of the operation. The second document outlined personnel assignments. 17 people involved in the transport operation, each assigned specific responsibilities. Riley recognized 3 names from her intelligence briefing, operatives known to have committed violence during previous trafficking operations. The 4th name was Victor Kowalski. He would personally oversee the operation, riding in the lead vehicle, maintaining direct communication with distribution personnel. The third document detailed the victims. 80 individuals, primarily young women and teenagers, sourced from various locations across the Southwest. The document listed their ages, their origin locations, and their assigned destinations. Some were marked for domestic distribution. Others carried notations suggesting international transfer after reaching terminal distribution points. Riley studied the document with the clinical precision her training had developed, but underneath that clinical analysis was a visceral reaction to the dehumanization represented in those pages. The victims weren't described as people. They were inventory. They were assets. They were numbers in a spreadsheet representing profit. The final document was an operational timeline showing transport departure, checkpoint passages, scheduled stops, and expected arrival times. The operation would begin on Friday morning, proceed through the weekend, and conclude on Monday evening. The window for federal law enforcement interception was narrow, maybe 48 hours maximum once the operation was active. Riley completed her photography by midnight. She encrypted the digital files using security protocols provided by Marcus and prepared them for transmission through channels that the organization had established. The data package, once transmitted, would be received by federal agencies within hours. Within days, law enforcement could position assets to intercept the transport operation. But she had a problem. If she transmitted the intelligence immediately, federal agencies would have time to plan and execute an interception. But the interception itself would compromise her cover. Law enforcement visibility would alert Kowalski that intelligence had been compromised. Kowalski would know that someone within his organization had provided information to authorities. Riley sat in her apartment in the darkness, understanding the operational complexity of her situation. She needed to provide Kowalski with the tactical analysis he'd requested while simultaneously ensuring that law enforcement had sufficient time to prepare interception operations. She needed to maintain her cover while enabling the rescue of 80 people who would otherwise be transported into exploitation and potential death. She spent the next 36 hours developing her tactical analysis. She reviewed the proposed routes and identified 3 potential security vulnerabilities, locations where law enforcement was likely conducting monitoring operations. She suggested alternative routes that appeared less vulnerable while actually directing the transport operation toward prepositioned federal assets. She provided detailed recommendations regarding personnel deployment and timing that would subtly slow the operation and provide law enforcement with additional window for interception. The analysis was masterful in its duplicity. To Kowalski's eyes, it would appear as legitimate tactical consultation designed to optimize security and efficiency. To federal law enforcement who would receive the information through Riley's intelligence channel, it would appear as deliberate guidance directing the operation toward specific interception points. Riley submitted the analysis to Devon at exactly the 48-hour mark. The document was 15 pages long, typed on official letterhead from Maverick's edge, signed with her full name. It represented a formal commitment to the trafficking organization, a concrete record of her willingness to participate in operational planning that facilitated human exploitation. It also represented the most sophisticated intelligence she'd provided in her entire career. Devon took the analysis with an expression of professional satisfaction. "Kowalski will review this," he said. "If he's satisfied, he'll contact you directly. If he's not satisfied..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I understand," Riley said. The contact came 20 hours later. The phone call was routed through a scrambled connection, but the voice on the other end was unmistakably Kowalski's. Accented English with the particular quality of someone for whom Russian was their native language. "Your analysis is competent," Kowalski said without preamble. "The route optimizations are functional. The personnel recommendations are sound. However, I am concerned about your reliability. You rejected us once. Why should I trust that you won't reject us again? Because the first time you approached me, I was still convinced that civilian separation was possible," Riley replied. "I've now accepted that separation isn't sustainable. I'm offering you the services of someone who understands the work and is willing to participate. That's more valuable than someone working under coercion or false motivation. You understand that if you betray me, I will ensure your death is particularly unpleasant?" Kowalski asked. "I understand," Riley said, "which is why I won't betray you. Professional relationships are based on mutual benefit and mutual respect. You're offering significant compensation. I'm offering legitimate tactical expertise. That arrangement serves both parties." There was a pause on the line. Then, "Very well. You're correct that I need someone with legitimate operational background to expand my organization's capability. I'm offering you a permanent position, consulting on tactical planning, operational security, and personnel management. The compensation is $500,000 annually, plus percentage shares on successful operations. You would report directly to me." Riley understood what she was being offered. A position of significant influence within Kowalski's organization. Access to everything: personnel, finances, international operations, victim distribution networks. She would be the most valuable intelligence asset federal law enforcement could position within a trafficking network. "I accept," Riley said. "Excellent. We'll arrange a meeting after the current operation concludes. I want you physically present during the transport operation, not actively participating, but observing. I want to assess your commitment and your capability in operational context." Riley's pulse accelerated at this requirement. Being physically present during the transport operation meant she would be in direct proximity to federal interception operations. It meant she would be visible to law enforcement. It meant her cover would be extremely difficult to maintain. "Where would this observation take place?" she asked carefully. "You'll be notified of your position 48 hours before operation commencement," Kowalski said. "I want minimal advance notice. It's a security precaution." The call ended. Riley sat in the darkness of her apartment, understanding the implications of what she'd just agreed to. She would be present during an operation that federal law enforcement was planning to intercept. She would be in direct physical proximity to the victims she was theoretically helping to rescue. She would have to navigate the complex operational space between her cover identity as a consulting member of Kowalski's organization and her actual status as an intelligence asset working against him. The next morning, Riley made her scheduled call to Marcus through a secure communication line. "He's offered me a permanent position," she reported. And he wants me present during the transport operation. That means I'll be physically present during federal interception. We anticipated that possibility, Marcus said calmly. Kowalski wouldn't trust you without direct observation. We've coordinated with federal agencies regarding your presence. Law enforcement has been notified that you'll be operating as an embedded asset. Protocols are in place to ensure your safety during the interception. What if something goes wrong? Riley asked. What if federal agents don't recognize me during active operation? What if the interception is messier than anticipated? Then you have authorization to take whatever actions are necessary to ensure your survival and safety, Marcus said. That supersedes all other operational objectives. If the federal operation deteriorates, you extract yourself, and we handle the legal consequences. Riley understood what Marcus was telling her. In the event of operational failure, she wasn't expendable, but she also wasn't protected by federal authority. She would be on her own, responsible for her own survival, operating in a space where distinction between law enforcement and criminal enterprise became blurred. This was the real operational climax. Not a moment of tactical victory or resolution, but a moment where multiple operational threads converged into a situation of profound complexity and genuine danger. There's something else you need to understand, Marcus continued. The intelligence you've provided, the documents you photographed, the analysis you submitted, the routes you suggested, that information will result in the rescue of 80 people. It will likely result in the arrest and prosecution of 17 individuals involved in trafficking operations. It will disrupt a significant portion of Kowalski's network in this region. He paused. But it won't stop trafficking. It won't eliminate Kowalski. It won't solve the systemic problems that allow human exploitation to persist. What it will do is save specific people from specific circumstances. And that matters. Not as a solution, but as a concrete action in response to concrete harm. Riley understood what he was saying. She'd accomplished something significant, but her accomplishment was partial, limited to a single operation, saving specific individuals while the larger system persisted. Your job now, Marcus continued, is to navigate the interception operation without compromising yourself. You maintain your cover as a member of Kowalski's organization. You observe the operation. You provide data on how law enforcement conducts interception. And you survive the experience intact so that you can continue providing intelligence on Kowalski's expanding operations. This isn't the conclusion, Riley said, understanding the implication. No, Marcus confirmed. This is the beginning. The woman who provides analysis that saves 80 people is now the woman Kowalski will trust with increasingly sensitive information. Your value to him will increase. Your access will expand. Your potential impact will grow. After the call ended, Riley sat with this understanding. The operation she'd been conducting for the past 3 weeks had seemed like an endpoint, a way of confronting the threat that had forced her reactivation. But it wasn't an endpoint. It was a beginning point. It was the first step in a longer journey of embedded intelligence gathering, personal risk, and cumulative impact on an organization she was trying to dismantle from within. The woman who had spent 18 years trying to escape the work had just accepted a permanent role within an organization dedicated to human exploitation. She'd accepted it knowingly, understanding the moral complexity and the operational necessity. And she'd accepted it understanding that the operation she was about to participate in would test everything she'd learned during her reactivation. The transport operation began at 4:47 a.m. on Friday morning. Riley received her position assignment via encrypted text message at 2 a.m. She would be riding in the fourth vehicle, positioned behind the primary distribution vehicles, ostensibly as an observer and security consultant. The message included a GPS coordinate where she would meet Carson Devon, who would facilitate her insertion into the operational convoy. The coordinate was a truck stop 20 miles north of Northridge, a location Riley recognized as being approximately 3 miles from a federal staging area that Marcus had described during their final briefing. The proximity wasn't accidental. It was part of the operational planning designed to position her where law enforcement could maintain observation and provide rapid extraction if necessary. Riley dressed in dark tactical clothing, clothing that would allow her to blend into Kowalski's operational personnel, while remaining distinct enough that federal agencies could identify her during the interception. She carried minimal equipment: water bottle, communication device, identification documents establishing her as a legitimate member of the organization. She left Maverick's edge locked and dark, knowing that she might not return to her civilian life for several days. The truck stop was nearly empty at 3:30 a.m. Only a few long-haul truckers sat in the restaurant, drinking coffee and studying maps, engaged in the quiet routines of people who earned their living on American highways. Riley positioned herself in the parking area as specified, watching the darkness gradually transition toward pre-dawn gray. Carson Devon arrived at 4:15 a.m. in a black SUV. Two men Riley didn't recognize were with him, operatives with the particular bearing of Kowalski's direct personnel rather than blackjack members. Without introduction or explanation, they gestured for her to climb into the vehicle. The convoy was assembled 8 miles north of the truck stop, parked in a rural area accessed by a series of increasingly isolated roads. Riley counted 9 vehicles total, 2 heavy trucks with enclosed cargo areas, for sedans carrying security personnel, 2 support vehicles, and 1 command vehicle where Kowalski would presumably maintain operational coordination. Victor Kowalski himself was standing beside the command vehicle when they arrived. In person, he was smaller than his photographs suggested, but his presence was larger. He was perhaps 5'9", with the kind of physical intensity that transcended height. His scarred face suggested violence both received and delivered. His eyes moved constantly, assessing the convoy, assessing his personnel, assessing the ambient environment with the particular quality of someone trained to identify threats. "Commander Vasquez," Kowalski said, approaching her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to operational experience beyond theoretical consulting." "I appreciate the opportunity," Riley replied, maintaining professional bearing. "I'm ready to observe and provide analysis of operational execution." "Excellent," Kowalski said. "You'll ride in the command vehicle. I want you to understand the full scope of the operation, communication protocols, personnel management, timing coordination. By the time this operation concludes, you'll understand why my organization has been successful despite law enforcement pressure." He gestured toward the command vehicle. Riley complied, climbing into the back where communication equipment was arranged around a central planning table. A communications specialist was monitoring multiple radio frequencies. A logistics coordinator was tracking vehicle positions and timing. Kowalski took position at the head of the operation, his voice calm and authoritative as he began coordinating the convoy's movement. "All units, this is Control," he said into the radio. "Commencing operation at 0447 hours. Route 1 vehicles proceed to secondary checkpoint. Route 2 vehicles maintain standing position. Route 3 vehicles prepare for deployment in 60 minutes. The convoy began moving with coordinated precision that suggested extensive planning and operational rehearsal. The primary transport vehicles departed first, heading north on State Highway toward Wyoming. The security vehicles followed at staggered intervals, their positioning designed to provide coverage while maintaining operational security. Riley observed everything with the analytical clarity of someone trained in tactical assessment. She noted the communication protocols Kowalski used, the way he coordinated multiple vehicle movements, the way he maintained awareness of law enforcement positions through contacts he apparently maintained within state police departments. The operation was sophisticated, far more sophisticated than her initial intelligence briefing had suggested. As the convoy moved through the morning darkness, Riley transmitted continuous data through the communication device concealed in her tactical vest. The data was encrypted and routed through federal intelligence channels, providing real-time updates on convoy position, operational status, and timing. By 9 a.m., the primary transport vehicles had crossed into Wyoming. The secondary vehicles dispersed toward different routes. Kowalski maintained his position in the command vehicle, monitoring progress, adjusting timing based on law enforcement reports he received through his communication channels. Riley understood in those hours what Marcus had been trying to teach her. The trafficking network wasn't simply a collection of criminals engaging in opportunistic exploitation. It was an organized system, sophisticated and adaptive, with extensive resources and institutional knowledge. Dismantling it would require more than a single interception operation. It would require sustained intelligence gathering, persistent pressure on operational nodes, and the kind of long-term commitment that she was now committing to. At 11:30 a.m., approximately 200 miles north of Northridge and deep in rural Wyoming, Kowalski received a radio transmission that made his expression shift subtly. "Control, this is Scout 1, the voice said through the encrypted radio frequency. We have law enforcement movement. Colorado State Police establishing checkpoint at Junction 17. Appears to be random traffic stop, but positioning is optimal for interdiction operations." Kowalski's hands remained steady, but Riley observed the moment of calculation in his eyes. He was assessing whether the checkpoint was coincidental or deliberately positioned. "Scout 1, continue monitoring," Kowalski said calmly. "Relay all position updates. All route vehicles, divert to secondary Route 7. Initiate timing delay of 40 minutes. We'll bypass the checkpoint entirely." The vehicles were being redirected. Federal law enforcement had positioned an initial interception point, and Kowalski had identified it and adjusted his operational plan accordingly. Riley felt a moment of panic. The federal operation was deteriorating. Kowalski's operational security was superior to what federal agencies had apparently anticipated. The 80 people in the transport vehicles were now being moved toward a different route, one that law enforcement apparently hadn't secured. She made a decision. "Kowalski," Riley said quietly, moving to his position at the communication console. "I want to suggest an operational adjustment." Kowalski turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "The checkpoint you're avoiding is likely to draw attention to the convoy if we attempt an alternative route," Riley continued, speaking with the confidence of someone providing legitimate tactical assessment. "Law enforcement monitors communication patterns. If we divert, they'll note the deviation and potentially increase surveillance on secondary routes." "Your point?" Kowalski asked. "My point is that I'd recommend proceeding directly through the checkpoint," Riley said. "Our vehicles are clean, no contraband, legitimate documentation, passengers with appropriate identification. A random traffic stop would reveal nothing suspicious. We'd pass through, continue on original timeline, and reach the distribution point without additional law enforcement attention." Kowalski studied her with the intensity of someone assessing whether she was providing legitimate advice or deliberately sabotaging his operation. "You're recommending we proceed directly toward law enforcement interception?" he asked. "I'm recommending we proceed with calculated risk," Riley replied. "Diversions create patterns. Patterns create investigation. Clean passage through a random checkpoint creates no suspicion at all. The checkpoint officer sees 9 vehicles, run license plates, find nothing irregular, and waves them through." Kowalski was quiet for a long moment. Then a smile appeared on his scarred face, a smile of genuine appreciation for the tactical reasoning. "You think like an operator," he said. "You understand risk management beyond simple avoidance. Excellent assessment, Commander." He turned back to the radio. "Scout 1, cancel secondary route diversion. All vehicles maintain original route. Proceed through checkpoint at Junction 17 as planned. Maintain vehicle spacing and communication discipline." Riley felt her pulse accelerate. She just convinced Kowalski to drive directly toward the federal interception operation. She'd redirected an entire trafficking convoy toward law enforcement positions that had been established specifically to intercept that operation. The next hour was a study in operational tension. The convoy maintained its original course, heading directly toward the established checkpoint. Riley monitored Kowalski's communications, noting the precise moment when scout vehicles confirmed that the checkpoint was indeed legitimate. Colorado State Police with portable document verification equipment, conducting random traffic stops on vehicles traveling north. At 1:15 p.m., the lead vehicles of the convoy approached the checkpoint. Riley observed the tactical choreography of the federal operation, the way officers positioned themselves, the way they created controlled spaces for vehicle inspection, the way they maintained awareness of approaching vehicles. Then the operation began. Federal vehicles blocked the secondary roads. Tactical teams deployed from positions concealed along the highway. The lead transport vehicles were forced to stop. Armed officers surrounded all 9 vehicles of the convoy, weapons drawn, commands broadcast through loudspeakers. Kowalski's hands moved toward a concealed weapon, but Riley was faster. She struck his hand with deliberate precision, disarming him without visible injury. His personal security was immediately overpowered by federal tactical teams that had positioned themselves inside the command vehicle specifically to prevent Kowalski's escape or ability to harm anyone during the operation. "Command, this is Vasquez," Riley transmitted through her communication device as federal agents surrounded the vehicle. "Operation successful. Kowalski apprehended. Convoy neutralized. Proceeding to ground with federal custody." What happened in the following hours was controlled chaos. Federal agents extracted the 80 trafficking victims from the enclosed transport vehicles and began the process of establishing emergency care, documenting their identities, and coordinating evacuation to federal facilities. Law enforcement arrested 17 members of Kowalski's organization. Federal prosecutors would begin building cases against them, utilizing the documentation Riley had photographed and the intelligence she'd provided. Kowalski himself was arrested with multiple federal warrants: human trafficking, money laundering, international organized crime, conspiracy. His organization's operations in the Rocky Mountain region were effectively dismantled. But the most significant moment came later that evening, when Marcus arrived at the federal detention facility where Riley was being debriefed by federal agents. "You performed exceptionally," Marcus said, meeting her in a private room away from other personnel. "The intelligence you provided, the interception operation you guided, the tactical decisions you made in the moment, all of it was executed at the highest standard." 80 people are safe," Riley said. "Kowalski is in custody. His organization is partially dismantled." "Yes," Marcus confirmed. "But that's not the real victory." He placed a folder on the table between them. Inside were photographs and documents. Images of the 80 rescued individuals being reunited with families, reports from federal prosecutors outlining the charges being filed, intelligence summaries showing how Kowalski's dismantled operation had been expanded nationally. "The real victory," Marcus continued, "is that you've proven something to yourself. You've proven that you can operate in spaces of profound moral complexity without losing your fundamental values. You can participate in systems you're trying to dismantle. You can provide expertise to organizations you oppose. You can make tactical decisions that seem to contradict your core principles. And through all of that, you can maintain focus on the larger objective, protecting people who can't protect themselves." Riley looked at the photographs of reunited families, understanding what Marcus was saying. "This isn't the end of your operational engagement," Marcus said. "Kowalski's arrest will disrupt his organization, but the trafficking network extends far beyond him. There are other coordinators, other operations, other victims waiting for rescue. The federal operation you just completed has generated intelligence that will support additional operations across multiple states." "You want me to continue," Riley said. "It wasn't a question. I want you to understand that you're exactly where you should be," Marcus said. "The woman who tried to escape the work, who built a civilian life, who thought she'd separated herself from operational necessity, that woman has discovered that her capability is most valuable in situations of profound injustice. That's not a failure of your civilian separation. That's the discovery of your true purpose." The official briefing was conducted in a secure federal facility outside Denver, 3 days after Kowalski's arrest. Representatives from the FBI, Homeland Security, the DEA, and state law enforcement agencies were present, along with Marcus and several members of his private consulting organization. The meeting room was designed for high-level intelligence coordination, secure communications, climate control, multiple displays showing operational data and intelligence summaries. FBI Special Agent James Morrison led the briefing. He was mid-50s, with the particular bearing of someone who'd spent 25 years in law enforcement and had learned to evaluate tactical excellence regardless of its source. He reviewed the operation's success metrics with clinical precision. The interception resulted in the rescue of 83 victims, 80 from the primary transport operation and 3 additional individuals discovered during secondary vehicle search. Morrison began, displaying photographs and documentation. All victims have been connected with appropriate support services. Medical evaluations are underway for 47 individuals showing signs of trauma or exploitation. He advanced to the next slide showing arrest and prosecution information. 17 members of Kowalski's organization have been arrested and are facing federal charges. Preliminary prosecutorial analysis suggests conviction rates exceeding 90% based on the intelligence package provided by embedded operative Riley Vasquez. Victor Kowalski himself is being held without bail pending trial on 23 federal counts related to human trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy. Morrison turned directly to Riley, who sat observing the briefing with the particular quality of someone accustomed to being analyzed by authority figures. Commander Vasquez's intelligence gathering was exceptional, Morrison continued. The operational documentation she photographed, the tactical analysis she provided to Kowalski's organization, and her real-time guidance during the interception operation represented the gold standard of embedded intelligence work. Her contribution directly resulted in the rescue of 83 human beings and the dismantling of a significant trafficking operation. He paused, and Riley could see something shift in his expression. A recognition that moved beyond professional appreciation toward genuine respect. We want to extend federal protection and support for ongoing intelligence gathering, Morrison said directly to Riley. Kowalski's arrest has disrupted his regional organization, but the broader trafficking network extends across 12 states. We believe that your continued operational engagement could provide intelligence supporting additional operations and rescues. What would that commitment look like? Riley asked. 3 to 5 additional operations over the next 18 months, Morrison said. Each operation would target different trafficking networks, different operational structures, different geographic regions. You would be embedded as consulting personnel, providing intelligence that allows federal law enforcement to identify and intercept trafficking operations before victims reach terminal distribution points. And my legal status? Riley asked. Full federal protection, Marcus said, answering before Morrison could respond. You would be operating under Federal Intelligence Authority with authorization from the Department of Justice. Any legal complications arising from your embedded activities would be handled by federal prosecutors. You would maintain operational immunity for all actions taken in service of the intelligence mission. Riley understood the significance of what was being offered. Legal protection, federal authority, institutional backing. She would be operating not as a private consultant but as an embedded federal asset, with all the complications that status entailed. There's something else you should know, Morrison said, retrieving a separate document. During the processing of Kowalski's arrested personnel, we discovered detailed records regarding his organization's operations and personnel. One of those records contained information about how Kowalski identified you initially and why he believed you were a significant asset. He slid the document across the table. It was a transcription of a conversation between Kowalski and another trafficking coordinator, recorded during a covert surveillance operation. Riley read the transcript carefully. The conversation described her background in detail, her military service, her operational deployments, her final assignments before separation. But it also described something else. Kowalski's knowledge that Riley's previous command decisions had resulted in the deaths of trafficking victims during a classified operation in Afghanistan. The transcript showed Kowalski discussing how he'd specifically targeted Riley because he believed her previous moral compromises would make her vulnerable to recruitment. He believed she'd already crossed the line separating legitimate military operations from participation in exploitation, and therefore recruiting her would be feasible. Riley set down the document, understanding the implications of what she'd just read. He thought you were already compromised, Marcus said quietly. He thought your previous operational decisions meant you'd already abandoned moral boundaries. He thought recruiting you would be straightforward because he believed you'd already demonstrated willingness to participate in systems that harm people. What he misunderstood, Morrison added, was the distinction between accepting moral complexity and abandoning moral principles. You made decisions during your military career that had tragic consequences. You carried that weight. That weight didn't compromise you. It deepened your commitment to preventing similar harm in different contexts. Riley understood what they were saying. Kowalski had believed her previous moral compromises made her recruitable. What he'd failed to understand was that those compromises had been exactly what made her opposed to his organization's existence. "I'll accept the federal protection," Riley said. "I'll continue with the intelligence-gathering operations. But I want it understood that my commitment is to the victims, not to the federal system. If institutional interests conflict with victim protection, my priority remains with victim protection." Morrison nodded. "That's understood and appreciated. Your commitment to the individuals being exploited, not to bureaucratic processes, is what makes your work so effective." Over the next week, Riley began the process of reintegrating into her civilian life while maintaining her operational status. She returned to Northridge, reopened Maverick's Edge, and resumed the visible routines of a woman operating a motorcycle repair business. To the community, Riley had simply been dealing with personal matters for several days. To the federal intelligence apparatus, she was a fully activated embedded asset awaiting her next operational deployment. The Bonneville restoration was completed during this period. Marcus arrived on a Tuesday afternoon to inspect the finished work and finalize the restoration project that had initiated his contact with Riley 3 months earlier. "It's exceptional," Marcus said, examining every detail of the completed motorcycle. "The restoration is perfect, mechanically sound, aesthetically authentic, completely transformed from what it was." "That was always the goal," Riley said. "Take something broken and make it whole again." "Yes," Marcus said, his expression suggesting he wasn't entirely talking about the motorcycle. "Sometimes the best restorations are people, not machines." He arranged for the Bonneville to be transported back to his facilities, and as Riley watched the motorcycle leave her shop for the last time, she felt the particular quality of completion that came from successful project termination. But the real completion came weeks later, when she received notification that Kowalski had been convicted on all 23 federal charges and sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing included testimony from 17 of the victims Kowalski had trafficked, describing the conditions of their exploitation and the circumstances of their rescue. Riley attended the sentencing, sitting in the back of the courtroom, observing Kowalski's expressions as victim after victim described the horrors of their captivity. She saw him attempt to project indifference, saw him occasionally display genuine rage at being held accountable for his actions. But she also saw something else. The recognition in Kowalski's eyes when he realized that his downfall had been orchestrated by the woman he'd believed he was recruiting. When he looked directly at Riley, she saw the moment when understanding crystallized. She saw him recognize that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone whose moral complexity made her infinitely more dangerous than he'd anticipated. After the sentencing, Riley was approached by one of the victims, a young woman named Maria Sanchez, who'd been 17 years old when trafficked and was now 23. Maria approached Riley in the courthouse hallway with the kind of deliberate courage that suggested she'd worked extensively to overcome the trauma of her exploitation. "I want to thank you," Maria said simply. "The federal agents told me you were the reason we were rescued. You went into that organization knowing what could happen to you, and you did it to save people you didn't know." Riley felt a moment of profound difficulty. She wanted to explain the complexity of her motivation, the way her actions had been driven by personal necessity as much as altruism. She wanted to be honest about the moral compromises and the operational objectives that hadn't always perfectly aligned with victim protection. But she also understood that Maria didn't need to hear that complexity. Maria needed to understand that her rescue had been the product of deliberate action by someone who prioritized her survival above other considerations. "I'm glad you're safe," Riley said simply. "I'm going to college," Maria continued. "I'm studying social work. I want to help other people who've experienced what I experienced. And it's only possible because you did what you did." After Maria left, Riley sat alone in the courthouse hallway, understanding the ripple effects of her operational work. She'd rescued 83 people from a single trafficking operation. Those people were now reconnecting with families, seeking education, pursuing lives they'd been denied. They were becoming advocates, survivors, agents of change in their own communities. That impact extended far beyond the immediate operation. The federal prosecution of Kowalski's organization had generated intelligence that enabled additional operations in other states. 3 more trafficking networks had been disrupted based on intelligence extracted during Kowalski's organization's dismantling. 47 additional victims had been rescued. 53 trafficking operatives had been arrested and prosecuted. Maverick's Edge continued operating throughout this period, providing cover and income. Riley worked on motorcycle restorations, maintained customer relationships, and preserved the visible life that allowed her to function as an embedded intelligence asset. To the community of Northridge, she was simply the capable woman who ran an excellent repair shop. To federal intelligence agencies, she was an exceptionally valuable asset providing strategic intelligence on trafficking operations across multiple states. 6 months after Kowalski's conviction, Marcus visited Riley at Maverick's Edge with news of the next operational assignment. It would take her to Phoenix, Arizona, where a trafficking network was operating under the protection of corrupt law enforcement. The operation would be more complex than the Kowalski assignment, with higher personal risk and greater operational difficulty. Riley accepted the assignment without hesitation. She'd crossed the threshold from civilian separation into operational reactivation, and she discovered that her capability was most effectively utilized in spaces where systematic exploitation needed to be confronted and dismantled. "You could still walk away," Marcus said, offering her the option he'd offered her on the first morning at her shop. "You've proven yourself. You could return to full civilian status, maintain Maverick's Edge as a legitimate business, and live quietly in Northridge." "No," Riley said without considering the possibility. "I couldn't. I thought I could for 18 years, but the moment they threatened me, I understood that separation was only ever temporary dormancy. The work matters. The victims matter. That's what matters now." Marcus nodded, having anticipated her response. "Then welcome back, Commander," he said. "The woman who tried to escape the work has become the woman who defines the work. That's not a failure or a compromise. That's the realization of your actual purpose." As Marcus left her shop that afternoon, Riley returned to her workbench and the motorcycle she was currently restoring. It was a 1972 Harley-Davidson, badly damaged, in need of comprehensive rehabilitation. She examined the damaged components, assessing what could be salvaged and what would need replacement. It was the work she'd always been suited for, taking broken things and making them whole, understanding the damage they'd sustained, and systematically restoring them to their intended function. She would leave for Phoenix in 3 weeks. She would embed herself in a new trafficking organization, gather intelligence, guide law enforcement operations, and rescue people being held in captivity. And when that operation concluded, there would be another and another after that. The work would continue because the trafficking persisted, the exploitation continued, and there were people whose freedom depended on someone willing to operate in the dark spaces where systematic harm occurred. The woman who had tried to escape her past had discovered that her past wasn't a limitation. It was her greatest asset. The moral complexity she'd carried for 2 decades, the weight of decisions that had harmed people even when intended to protect them, the understanding of how good intentions could enable systemic exploitation, all of it made her the perfect instrument for confronting the organizations that Riley now understood were her actual responsibility. Outside the shop, Northridge continued its quiet existence, unaware that a woman of extraordinary capability was operating in its midst, unaware that federal law enforcement was using her intelligence to dismantle criminal networks across multiple states, unaware that the woman who ran the motorcycle repair shop was among the most effective operatives the federal government had ever deployed against human trafficking. And Riley, sitting at her workbench, examining the damaged motorcycle that required restoration, understood that this was exactly where she belonged. Not in civilian separation, not in institutional service, but in the complex space between legitimate and illegitimate worlds, using her exceptional capability to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. This was the transformation that had begun the moment Marcus Holloway walked through her shop door. This was the journey that had started with harassment and escalated into federal operations. This was the discovery of her actual purpose. Not as a military officer, not as a civilian business owner, but as someone willing to operate in impossible situations and emerge with victims rescued, networks disrupted, and systemic harm reduced. The Ghost Angel, as federal intelligence agencies had begun calling her, was ready for the next operation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.